Welcome to Type 40, a Doctor Who podcast here on the Fandom Podcast Network. On this show, we will take an in-depth and closer look at this beloved television series, the spin-offs, the merchandising, and the global fandom phenomenon that has shaped the landscape of science fiction for over 5 decades and counting. So step on our TARDIS and please enjoy our journey together here on Type 40. Of course, I'm Kyle, but I can never pilot the TARDIS alone. I have to have my companions, my best friends. And it starts with, of course, one of the great FPNet co-founders and also the co-host of not only here on Type 40, but Blood of Kings, Mr. Norman C. Lau. How are you this morning, Norman?
I'm fantastic. I love talking about Doctor Who, and it's just so invigorating and so energizing just to be able to get my brain in this space again, because, you know, we're heading on towards Jodi Whittaker's, you know, her debut performance. Well, not her debut performance, quote unquote, you know, her first episode as the Doctor. And it's just very exciting. It's very exciting to be able to talk to new fans about this. So I'm glad that we're all together to do this again.
Absolutely. And of course, to bring in us the opposite side perspective of all things with the Doctor, I know he's fresh from doing repairs on K9. Of course, returning, he is the man who runs the Space Book, and he is also your fellow co-host here on Type 40. Mr. Dan Hadley is back with us. How you doing, Dan?
Hello, everybody. Time flies. Here we are back again. Yeah, I've got a few nuts and bolts on the floor. I'm sure I'll work out where they go later, but he seems okay.
There's always a few parts left over anyway.
Yeah, it's nothing to worry about. Yeah, it's I can't believe it's getting closer. It's only about 2 months away at the most. That's even being a conservative estimate. Yes, always something new to talk about.
We don't have a date, do we? Like a date?
Not
we
yet.
Just have October. We just have October. That's all we have.
Waiting patiently.
Well, as we wait, there's a certain fixed point in time we must address. Norman, would you be glad to help me out with this one?
Absolutely. So, if you would like to find Type 40 across all of the subspace airwaves and the wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey universe, you can find us on the FPNet master feed. That's fpnet.podbean.com. You can also find us on the Podbean app at FPNet. You can find the Fandom Podcast Network on iTunes, Stitcher, Podbean, and Google Play for Android users. You can find us on Instagram at Fandom Podcast Network and at Type 40 Doctor Who. That's TYPE40 DRWHO. You can also find us on Facebook on our Type 40 fandom page. That's Type 40, a Doctor Who fandom podcast. Just go to facebook.com/groups, or you can search Type 40 in your search field there on Facebook. If you'd like to contact us directly, you can email us at type40doctorwho@gmail.com. You can also find us on Twitter at Type40 Doctor Who. Remember, that's TYPE40 DRWHO. Also on Instagram at Type40 at Type40 Doctor Who. You can find me on Twitter at Starfighter1701 and on Instagram at SoCalSwordfighter. And how about you guys? Kyle, where can our fans find you on social media?
Well, you can find me on social media on Twitter at AKyleW and on Instagram at AKyleFandom.
And Dan, how about yourself?
And I'm on Instagram as well at DanHadley_ and pretty much permanently flitting through Facebook between the Type 40 Facebook group and the Space Book, where we talk about everything outside of the TARDIS. And yeah, come and find us. Come and find all of us. Come and have a chat.
Fantastic. You can also visit us on our TeePublic store. Now, if you'd like to help support us and wear some of our logos from some of our shirts that you may recognize on our master feed or on social media, such as like Blood of Kings, Culture Clash, Good Evening, the Alfred Hitchcock Podcast, and now Type 40, you can find us on tpublic.com/user/Fandom Podcast Network, or just search Fandom Podcast Network on TeePublic. You can also find us on the master feed on iTunes. So please search Fandom Podcast Network on iTunes. Please leave us a review. so that new fans can find us easier. We love 5-star reviews if we earn those 5-star reviews, but we love feedback in general. So let us know how we're doing here on Type 40 so we can bring you the best content possible with all of our news on Doctor Who. Back to you, Kyle.
Thank you, Norman. Well, as I've been traveling the time vortex trying to figure out a topic for this week's show, I've come across something I think is actually a very key thing in Whovian history, and I think kind of plays well after the last show I hosted where we talked about the generational doctors of David Tennant and Tom Baker. I want to talk about the Americanization of Doctor Who, because a lot of people feel with the addition of the 11th Doctor in Matt Smith, that was a time when the United States especially really grasped into the Doctor Who fandom more than they ever have before. And of course, when we look through history, a lot of people in the United States were exposed to early Doctor Who through public broadcasting. And, there was never necessarily a rhyme or reason to it. There wasn't like, oh, this is appointment viewing at that time for a lot of people. It was public broadcasting. There wasn't a lot of advertising for it. Well, a lot of that changed really at the very end of the David Tennant run and definitely for sure the run that Matt Smith had as the 11th Doctor. And before we get into the main points of the show today, I want to ask both of you, and I want to start with you, Norman. Where do you feel that at the start of Matt Smith's run, that's when the U.S. really fully embraced Doctor Who as a major fandom?
I would say that Matt Smith was probably peaking for Doctor Who fans, but I really do think that David Tennant's tenure as the Doctor was really where it took off. I had an interesting conversation actually the other night with some friends after sword fighting practice. We were talking about Doctor Who. I was kind of pushing them to listen to the Type 40 podcast here. And this is one conversation that sounds very similar to other conversations that I had where some people, in my age range, they were they were flipping through channels like PBS and they found Tom Baker, maybe Peter Davison, maybe. And they said, that's the last time I saw Doctor Who until Christopher Eccleston, until this global reach of Doctor Who was able to be shared through social media and through the internet. So Christopher Eccleston brought them and gave them the interest to watch Doctor Who again, because it wasn't no offense, Dan, but it wasn't the cheesy BBC Doctor Who of the past. It was very slick. It was very well produced. It had high production value, and you had a household name with Christopher Eccleston as a mainstream actor, someone who had a lot of gravitas to him. It wasn't that he was this unknown and face-changing character that people didn't really seem to grab onto. And maybe that's part of this Americanization of Doctor Who, where every single time an American audience turned, there was a different face on the Doctor. So they really couldn't gravitate towards any one particular character. But I do think when David Tennant came on board, because he was younger, because he is handsome, because he's very charismatic, and because that new relationship dynamic between he and Rose was something that we never saw with the Doctor before, I think that drew in not just younger male viewers, which it was kind of directed towards, but it also brought in a lot of younger female viewers, probably around their tweens, in that very I guess that interested, that when you get interested in relationships and all that kind of stuff, almost kind of like when you start finding out and learning about romance and kind of like those teen romance novel types of interests, then you start seeing probably more of a shift and a balancing of both sides of the equation in that audience. And I do think that there are far more women now, or young women, that are more interested in the Doctor than ever before. That's just my personal assessment from a very top-down view. I could be wrong, but I think that's why David Tennant actually is where it started, in my opinion.
No, I can agree. I can agree with David Tennant. I think, but Matt Smith was the face of truly became the face that most people associated with the Americanization of Doctor Who, and I'll explain why once we get into the points. But Dan, I want to go to you, because I know, talking to friends of mine over in your area too, when Matt Smith took over as the Doctor, there was a lot of love and interest in Matt Smith, but there was also a feeling that Doctor Who became more written for the American audience at the time, and that the audience over in the United Kingdom was kind of a little left behind. Is that an accurate statement, or do you feel that differently on that?
I never felt that way personally. Obviously I can't speak for whoever you spoke to. It's a viewpoint that I have heard before. I didn't hear it a great deal at the time. Everybody was a little more fixated, more concerned on Matt Smith's age, from when he was revealed until he started playing the part, and probably a good 2 or 3 weeks in. But one thing that did come over, and I think the BBC were quite proud of it, and very sort of, and they were boasting about the fact that it was now a proper co-production, a team effort between the BBC and BBC America, and I think there's a good 2 or 3 other co-producers as well. But that was kind of it was seen as a boon to the show and as a next level up. And so with that, there came a certain amount of trepidation, because there are always naysayers, and I won't vilify naysayers. Sometimes concerns are grounded in reality, and when you care about something, of course, people are going to be concerned. But there was a concern that we were starting down a road, which, I mean, I thought this was ridiculous at the time, even more so now, that we were starting down a road which would lead to the BBC farming it out to BBC America 100%. So that there was that, but gradually, as regards the rest of it, it seemed initially very much business as usual. Like I said, I mean, maybe that's just me. I was still spending time then on Facebook. Maybe Facebook didn't dominate quite so much, but yeah, I didn't see so much of that. But I may well be wrong.
Well, no, and that's an interesting take, and you bring up that point, and I think it leads into the first point I want to bring up and really address here, guys. And Norman, I know you'll appreciate this with me. The American broadcast history of modern Who, because it's quite interesting. Now, real quick, Norman, when did you first start watching the current version of modern Who on TV?
Oh, it started with Christopher Eccleston.
So, were you watching the initial airings, or was it something that you caught on to later?
No, I was watching the initial airings. I mean, I was watching, starting from Rose and moving forward.
Okay.
And I think it's just because we have the access to all the different types of marketing on social media. Usually before, you had to find it in the newspaper or Starlog magazine or word of mouth, or there would be some type of big advertisement in your local comic book store, bookstore, or something like that. Yes, I'm dating myself. But at the same time, I think that's one of the great things about the power of social media, is that you have even the smaller marketing campaigns. And Doctor Who at that time, this was what, 2005? 7?
Yeah, 2005. Well, I'll go into that history here in just a minute and clarify something for you on that. Well, in fact, let me just hit that up real quick, because when we first look back at modern Who, the first modern season of Modern Who with Eccleston had completely aired in the United Kingdom and overseas before it even came to the U.S. It was actually originally scheduled to hit the U.S. for the first time on DVD when the UK DVD set came out. However, the Sci-Fi Channel picked up the broadcast rights of Modern Who starting on March 17th, 2006, and continued to broadcast Modern Who through 2008. It pulled in very solid ratings, but because it was not a heavily marketed show by Sci-Fi, because at the time, that's when Stargate SG-1, Stargate Atlantis, and of course the Battlestar Galactica remake were just booming for Sci-Fi at the time, and that's where all that was going as well. And also of note was the Sci-Fi Channel edited the episodes not only for commercials but broadcast time as well.
Maybe that's why I never really kind of took it too seriously seeing Doctor Who again, because again, as there's a lot of baggage that I was bringing with me when I was watching this. I'm like, okay, this is Doctor Who. I kind of my last memory of Doctor Who was the McGann movie, and that was 99, I think it was.
Yeah, 99. The Fox airing of the McGann movie, which Fox was hoping that would catch on and they'd give them a science fiction franchise to run with. Yeah. Didn't quite work that way. So, where things went from there is they aired Doctor Who well after the airings in the United Kingdom through season 4. But it was in 2009 where things began to change, because that's when the broadcast was moved to BBC America, and starting with the December 19th airing of The Waters of Mars in primetime, which marked the highest rated primetime ratings of the new era. Who in the US after those David Tennant specials brought the coming of Matt Smith, where BBC America was the only place you could find Doctor Who, starting with Matt Smith's first season, which began airing in the US on April 17th, 2010. Now, Dan, at this time, you guys overseas and in the UK were still getting the seasons well before we got them in the US. I mean, you guys had pretty much finished the seasons before they even began airing in the US at that time.
That seems like such a long time ago, doesn't it? Seems like another world entirely.
Yeah, it does, but I can remember that was kind of a big thing at the time, because we weren't quite in the full advent of social media yet, but there were still people trying to go on the internet to get spoilers about the seasons.
I remember, because at the time, I mean, pre-Facebook especially, I used to spend a lot of time on forums, on fan forums. The big one in particular, Gallifrey Base, which had been Outpost Gallifrey. But of course, in those places, they're very they're like a pressure cooker environment, pure 150% concentrated Doctor Who fans. Whereas on social media, as that started to take over, that became the main place you would exchange. It sort of would open up more to the casual audience. And so rather than trying to sort of second guess or report secondhand what the casual audience was thinking and saying and reacting to all over the world, we could actually pull them into the conversations now, and they couldn't do a thing about it. They couldn't do a thing to stop us. They were only ever a tag away. So, it was, looking at it from the UK, it's sort of, in hindsight, it's only when we look back in hindsight that we see what a difference it was. Living it at the time, because it was on the same channel, the same channel it had always been on for decades, in fact. It was on the same channel pretty much. It was the same day of the week, and the same people were talking about it. So hearing all of this information coming back and thinking, because of course I remember hearing that it was on sci-fi and it was here or there, but it was out of sight, out of mind. I hate to say this, but it was very much your problem. Please don't be offended by that.
Well, now, Norman, I want to ask you this, because what I remember too is, especially when the Tenet specials came out, there was a big push by BBC America finally on marketing for Doctor Who, because it seemed like all of a sudden the DVDs were just everywhere about that time. It kind of started with, they put out that special box set of the David Tennant special, of those specials that came out before the 11th season started, and there was a big push of re-release of all the DVD sets under BBC America. Am I remembering that properly, Norman?
Well, I mean, I think that's where a lot of this success is coming, because as a product, now we all have to remember, especially the listening audience out there, that Doctor Who is a product. It is a vehicle also for selling merchandise. So consistency of merchandising sales is paramount and predicated by a strong marketing strategy. So having the brand out there, having the new Doctor Who, the elongated oval brand on the magazines, on the toys, on the DVDs, created this really cohesive strategy here, finally, in the United States, that allowed the series to escalate with the viewership more so than in the past. Because, again, when we were watching it in the late 70s and early 80s, it was hit or miss when it came to the marketing. There was no merchandise to be spoken of. There wasn't really a lot of advertising to be spoken of. So the people that were watching Doctor Who at the time were die-hard, dyed-in-the-wool, I will find it and I will watch it at any time fans. But now, because of the advent of social media and the way that things are advertised, you can go to your Best Buy or your, at one point in time, maybe CompUSA, Circuit City, these kind of stores, these big box stores that have racks and racks and racks of end caps of DVDs, and find something that has this wall of cohesive marketing that's Doctor Who. When you go to the bookstore, they actually have sections now of Doctor Who books. They have, those special tables now that have the TARDIS backpacks and the Doctor Who Sonics and all the different bits and bobs of being able to continue branding that in the hearts and minds of the audience and the viewing public. So when Matt Smith finally was introduced post the David Tennant marketing push, the merchandising and the marketing was at an all-time high. You couldn't throw a stone without hitting something as small as a Jelly Baby, right? Because that's, for at least for the American audience, the more that you market and mass advertise something, the more it takes hold. And that allows us to own a piece. I'm not sure if it's the same way with the UK fan stand, but when American audiences can grab and own and take home and almost in a way idolize a piece of their fandom, that almost creates an unbreakable bond with the way that fans are. And especially when you see things that are offered at Comic-Con or any of the comic conventions like Salt Lake City or Denver or Los Angeles or Stanley, from a sonic screwdriver to a fez to a bow tie, the connection that was made from Matt Smith now moving forward is something in science fiction fandom that I've never seen take off before. And I think that's why in the Americanization of Doctor Who, the product placement and merchandising played a huge factor in it. And that's just my opinion. You guys may or may not disagree.
Well, comparing that to our experiences when it came to you, when it entered that sort of marketplace for you, as you say, you didn't have to look too far to find product too distant from the television. I mean, we've spoken before. I've described how Doctor Who exploded in this country in 2005, but it exploded in the sense of in people's imaginations, in people's day-to-day family lives. It was the television program people were talking about, and the branding. Although we got advertisements on bus shelters and huge advertising boards, the places you would expect to find them, merchandise was quite slow to trickle through. Looking back, it at the time it seemed like a big push from day one, but really it was quite small fry. I mean, perhaps in this country we do things slightly differently, and I'm talking back in 2005 here rather than 2010, where there was still this feeling that the new series of Doctor Who could quite easily have turned into a very expensive white elephant, and so maybe that was why the BBC were a little more reluctant to push. But then again, there was the fact that we lost Christopher Eccleston so soon, and his original figure was famously pulped, didn't even enter production. But the figure line took a few months to even start. The books took a good couple of months to start arriving, whereas by the time it got to you, the strategy was already in place for that much larger marketplace, a much more, and this is no slight on my own nation, but a generally much more open society that are more proud of the inner child. Over here, that what you're saying, Norman, about having to own a piece of what you'd seen on screen, that now is very much the case, and people will boast quite happily and geek out publicly, but 10, 12 years ago, that really wasn't the case, and it was still the province of children. So that's another area in which it's changed, and so to hear, this sort of experience that you both had as both viewers and consumers, it's the same but different.
No, those are good points. But where things really truly started to change as far as the broadcasting side of things was with the first Matt Smith Christmas special, which was the Christmas Carol take, which to this day I think is one of the more popular Christmas episodes of Doctor Who ever done. That became the first episode to broadcast on the same day in the UK and in the US. Followed up shortly after with the announcement that season 6, which started April 23rd, 2011, Doctor Who would begin broadcasting on the same day in both the US and the UK. Season 6 was the first time ever episodes of the show were also filmed in the United States. And I know that was a very big deal at the time. But that leads us into point 2, and we've talked about him already. Matt Smith, who at the time was the youngest Doctor ever to be cast as Doctor Who, following a trend that David Tennant had started, which Norman mentioned earlier, a younger, handsome-looking Doctor that really appealed to a younger demographic, especially here in the U.S. It was a key point for the younger generation. Another big thing with that, though, was the casting of an unknown at the time, Karen Gillan, as his companion for his run. At that time, too, they also became the first actors of Doctor Who to make an appearance at San Diego Comic-Con, and they would become a fixture at Hall H going forward. You also had Arthur Darvill join the cast as Rory, companion to Amy Pond, or as we like to refer to him, Mr. Pond. Correct, Norman?
That is absolutely correct. They are the Ponds, Mr. and Mrs. Pond.
Yeah, exactly. So, another big thing that was happening at this time, and I don't know if you remember this or not, was Chris Hardwick's involvement heavily in Doctor Who, and with the Nerdist and the BBC America, where they even spun out a Nerdist special every now and then on BBC America. And Chris Hardwick had developed quite the relationship with Matt Smith. Matt Smith had appeared on his Nerdist podcast here several times, along with Karen Gillan. And it was really a combination of those two that really brought a lot of forefront attention to Matt Smith here in the United States. But I think there's also another key addition to the 11th Doctor cast that was big in the U.S., and that was the addition of bringing back Alex Kingston's River Song into Matt Smith's run, because the American audiences were very familiar with Alex Kingston, not only for her appearance on Doctor Who from David Tennant's run, but for her very long run on the hit series ER and several other projects she had done in the States. Norman, I know Alex Kingston really brought something different to Doctor Who we hadn't seen in a while, and I know it was a really appealing American fans to really see that familiar face on their screens.
One of the things I think that was smart about bringing Alex Kingston back, it gave a continuity of sorts with a character that obviously became very influential to the Doctor later on, since their timelines converge from either back to front or front to back, depending on what their diaries say. But one of the things I wanted to really reinforce was when you said that Matt Smith and Karen Gillan were the first actors from Doctor Who to appear at San Diego Comic-Con. Because if you want to put a pin onto when the explosion of Doctor Who happened, probably in America, it was probably that moment. Because when you reveal anything at San Diego Comic-Con, it is like a nuclear bomb going off. That is ground zero for whether or not something is going to pass or fail in the mainstream social media market that is the United States, and the way that they ingest and share their fandom. So as soon as that happened, everyone had access to those two characters more so than probably any other character, and that became, again, this shatterpoint of this ripple effect that Matt Smith and Karen Gillan had. It could have been anyone. I'm not saying that Matt Smith and Karen Gillan weren't great. They were, but it could have been any actor. If Peter Capaldi was there for that reveal, it may have changed the course of him as the Doctor. So San Diego Comic-Con, the value that you place in that venue just can't be underestimated, because it can launch things to popularity that you can't even project. And I think that's what happened with Matt Smith.
Yeah. Now, I know you talked about it earlier, a little bit earlier. You brought up the point. Over in the UK, a lot of people were really concerned about Matt Smith's age coming in as the Doctor.
Very much so. But the media was preoccupied with it. Fandom, to a slightly lesser extent, was preoccupied with it. And because as an actor, too, he'd done so very little. Whereas, with Jodie Whittaker now, and certainly with Chris Eccleston, and even David Tennant, if you wanted to find out and get an inkling of what their Doctor may be like, the material was there to find. Attack the Block is everywhere. Broadchurch is on, you can watch that to stream anywhere in the world. But Matt Smith had appeared in 2 sort of reasonably medium profile shows, just in this country, which hadn't done particularly well, and he was part of an ensemble cast in both. So he was so it was a bit of both. All signs for many people, the bell of doom was being sounded when you put all those things together. But like I say, it didn't particularly last for long, and I think that once people saw who were being drafted, like you say, Alex Kingston, which they did try and keep under wraps, but didn't do a very good job of. That people had enjoyed her character so much in 2008. More than happy to see her back. And although she wasn't as big a name in the UK as she was in the States, ironically, because she's a British actress too, who started in British children's television. It was still known that this is a big deal. It's one of those things where, okay, the BBC clearly believed in him. We love this show. We've enjoyed it over the last few years. Cynicism was being held at bay by two or three very sturdy doorstops. You talk about San Diego Comic-Con. Believe it or not, we're still just a few weeks ago. We had the Comic-Con explosion with Jodi Whittaker and the new cast. But I find it still so strange when people ask me, even over social media, British people, so what is San Diego Comic-Con? It is still not mainstream in this country. It's still not known quite how big a deal the whole event is globally. And there's a little bit of resentment there about it when you do explain to people why. People can get a bit get a bit snotty, as we say in the UK, about it. But as you say, this has been proven now time and time again. You talk back to their first appearance, Matt Smith and Karen Gillan, which was however many years ago, 7, 8 years ago. Comic-Con's getting bigger, Doctor Who's getting bigger. Those two things clearly go hand in hand. You mentioned Chris Hardwick. I hate to say, for us here, there are probably plenty of people in the UK who are more familiar with him than I am, particularly The Walking Dead, the Talking Dead show. But until quite recently, he was one of those guys I knew the face but couldn't put the name to. Of course, now, having heard a little bit more about this story and how instrumental he was in it. Craig Ferguson's another character like Chris Hardwick, I believe, who didn't he host the late night talk show that James Corden now hosts?
Yes, and he was famous. He had a TARDIS on his desk during his run there.
He's another expat. He was a comedian in this country. He was in the very first series of Red Dwarf when he was a stand-up comedian. But over here he'd sort of disappeared, turned up over there. But he was also at university with Peter Capaldi, which we now know. With Chris Hardwick, with Craig Ferguson, and numerous other people, 3 or 4 really instrumental people who were very not just relentless in their promotion of the show, but also very sweet when talking about it and very inclusive, as if they were welcoming people in and sort of drumming up support for something that they believed in and were fond of, rather than pushing a product. I think that clearly made a big difference too. Over here, it's still very much corporate BBC. And you've seen how prevalent the BBC logo is. That sort of straddles everything. It's the BBC's Doctor Who, and whilst there are some people who do resent the BBC, it's sort of. I mean, even the showrunners over here are kind of faceless, as strange as that may seem, given the Comic-Con stage, where Chris Chibnall seemed just as much at home and just as welcomed almost as Jodi herself the other week. So it's this contrast. There is a definite contrast there, but a nice one. It's a wall that has gradually tumbled down rather than anybody having to punch through it. All this seems to have happened so organically over the last decade.
Yeah. No, and those are all good points too. One thing I do want to say out too that was a great help to the 11th Doctor of Doctor Who was, I think we can, as gentlemen, we can all agree that Karen Gillan may have created one of the most iconic looks in Doctor Who history in the very first episode she was in.
Yeah,
Wow.
that's an indelible image for sure. But at the same time, I think that she also was able to ground her character very quickly, and maybe it's because I never saw Matt Smith with any other performance. Same thing with Karen Gillan. It allowed me to believe their characters more quickly and not compare them to anything else. And I think that's kind of important sometimes, when you're dealing with something now as iconic as the Doctor, because sometimes you as fans, or we as fans, will bring previous experiences from other performances of other actors and try and, for lack of a better term, fit a square peg in a round hole, which is unfair sometimes to certain performances. I know that it was hard for me to accept Peter Capaldi as the Doctor because I loved him on the BBC's Musketeers as Cardinal Richelieu, who was a fantastic character because of him. And I harbored a little bit of fan resentment when he jumped ship, which I thought kind of reduced the quality of that show overall when he became the Doctor. And I wasn't really that big of a fan when that happened. Yeah. So I digress. I'll talk about that later. We'll talk about Capaldi later on.
Yeah. And of course that show did kind of end shortly after he left. But as all things with the Doctor, things do change. And during Matt Smith's run, we did have a change in companions as Karen Gillan exited the show, which I was heartbreaking to a lot of fans. But we were introduced to Jenna Coleman as Clara Oswald, or Clara Oswald, or Clara the housemaid, or in the first of all, actually introduced in season 10 in the opening episode in a very interesting take on where we actually saw the companion before she actually became the companion. But she knew she was going to be the next companion, which caused much confusion in the Doctor Who universe at the time. Then, of course, we get the official changeover to Jenna Coleman's Clara in the Christmas episode that year, which also introduced 3 very popular characters that have remained that way since in Madame Vastra, Drax, and Jenny, who almost got their own spin-off show by the time it was all said and done. And what I find interesting about this is they came out, were very complimentary to the 11th Doctor, and they carried over for a brief time with Capaldi's 12th Doctor, but it seemed like they were really given a boost here in America too by being part of the crew of the 11th Doctor, because I know I still to this day see cosplays of those characters everywhere, Norman.
And that's what the American audience does. As soon as you introduce something that a subsection of the fandom can actually own and celebrate, that's what's going to happen. And I think that the BBC was really smart about it when they saw how much the American audience embraced Sarah Jane Smith when she came back in, what was it, season 11? 12?
No.
I mean, we're talking about.
I think it was season 3 of Modern. Either season 2 or it was
series 2. Yes,
series 2. I'm getting my years confused with the whole previous thing. Like, which year was it? Because it was like 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008ish, maybe.
2007. I want to say.
So when that happened, and she had K9, because when David said K9, it was so cute, right? And you have the Doctor and K9 again. But anyway, I digress. So when you have, like I said, a subsection of the actual show meet a subsection of the fandom, those fans will really gravitate towards it. The only criticism I have about that is that I love the Centaurans, and Drax kind of makes the Centaurans cute and cuddly, which they're not. No, I'm serious. Like, Dan, you had like this weird look on your face, but it's true. If you actually look at the way the American audience approach, like Madame Vestra, Jenny, and Drax, Drax is this weird Centauran butler to them, and it's weird. Like, the Centaurans are supposed to be this. They have the deactivation disc on the back of their helmets because they only move forward. the Doom became more Centaurans than the Centaurans were.
I think that could have been part of the problem. When they brought the Centaurans back, we had that two-parter with David Tennant, and then they sort of didn't really know what to do. There's only so many things you can do with them, and so to introduce a character like Strax, again, this is making Doctor Who fans sound like a right miserable bunch, because they're not really. But are they? No, they're not. But there was a section of fandom that does resent Strax a little bit as being comic relief. That he lessens the effect of this race. You know, the Sontarans are quite a unique race, really, in Doctor Who history. But I think when you look at that group of characters, and as a unit, rather than the Silurian, the Sontaran, and the human, and how they function together, I think that sort of quite quickly becomes more important. And the camaraderie. Strax is the comic relief. That can't be doubted. But there's a nice backstory there between Strax and the Doctor, and how he came to make a deal with Strax that he would sort of turn over a new leaf. You know, without probably simplifying things, but that's effectively what he did. And it was the Doctor that brought those characters together, as if he knew that Strax was capable of more. And I'd have kind of liked to have seen that story, particularly with Matt Smith, because the public absolutely latched onto those three characters, and the fact that they appeared in far fewer stories than I think any of us are aware, but they cast a long shadow. Even now, I think there are people who want them back. There are certainly people now who would still really welcome that spin-off show. And part of me, I mean, I've never seen great, huge potential there, but I could certainly see why BBC America would maybe go for a TV movie with the Paternoster gang, based on the appeal that I can see from the cosplay community, and just in speaking to you guys. You know, so that, I'm even changing my opinion about that. But yeah, I mean, all of this, it's all extending the reach of the show, deepening the texture of the universe that the Doctor exists in. And I think that when you introduce a character like him, who has this sort of tragic side, and you see people come and go out of his life, to see the different kinds of relationships that he forms, the decisions that he makes, and the people that he brings together, that never loses its potency. And maybe one day we will return to those characters. Perhaps for the 60th anniversary. Who knows? There'll be 4 or 5 years' time.
Yeah, not that far off. Now that moves along to point 3, and we've talked about this a little bit. Is, of course, when Matt Smith took over the 11th Doctor, Stephen Moffat took over as the showrunner, and many feel to this day that the style he presented the show in was more intended to bring in more of the American viewer. We talked about it earlier, where there was episodes of Doctor Who that were actually filmed in the U.S. We had the episodes where the Doctors had interaction with the American president, NASA, stories told in old New York as well. And I think some of the biggest monsters, which I think are still very much identified in the States, Moffat really put a bigger spotlight on the Weeping Angels, and also his creation of the Silence during the 11th Doctor's run. Those were pretty much, I think a lot of people will say, those were two of the main antagonists for the Doctor during Matt Smith's run. However, one person who was missing during that run was the Master. Now, Dan, I'm curious with you, because it really seems like to me that the Weeping Angels, for instance, were brought in very much to a spotlight with Moffat's run, even though we had seen them in the classic Blink episode before that. But do you feel like that the 11th Doctor really kind of had brought his own villains and monsters to creation, as much as it was, you also had Daleks and Cyberman, but there was really some, for the 11th Doctor, specifically created monsters?
Definitely. again, this is something that only really hits you with hindsight. Now we're 3 or 4 years on from Matt Smith's era having wrapped up, and the way that it wrapped up, Stephen Moffat may have pulled a bit of a fast one there. He tied so many strings in that final episode. I'm amazed his fingers didn't get stitched in there somewhere. But it does make this sort of glorious arc with these characters. The Weeping Angels in particular stand out to me, mostly because they're just so scary. The notion of them is so scary, and the Silents are a sort of hybrid of the same kind of appeal, mixed in with the Cybermen, with the more traditional sort of stomping villainy that we're used to from standard Doctor Who creations. But it all works so well. And looking back with Matt Smith's Doctor, quite often the whole era gets the fairy tale tag, and with good reason. And I think when you look at a character like Matt Smith's Doctor, who has this sort of Peter Pan energy, and as direct opposite, you've got something as imposing, as threatening, and as no nonsense, zero tolerance as the Silents. They don't question their actions. It's a ruthless precision at which both the Silents and the Weeping Angels operate, and it's sort of, it doesn't matter how much you're enjoying whatever it is you're doing in the Doctor's case, or the journey with the companions. If you get in their way, your odds aren't in your favour, as Amy and Rory found out. So yeah, I think that if Matt Smith's era is stocked with big ideas and with memorable notions and things that play on your mind. Sometimes the characters that only appear once, such as help me out a little bit. What's the Toby Jones character in Amy's Choice?
Oh, okay, yes, I can't think of the name, but I know who you're
I can't remember his name. The Dream Lord. The Dream Lord. How could I forget that? Characters like the Dream Lord, they come from a similar place too. And this is one of the reasons, really, why I feel, I know we're getting slightly off topic, but why I feel that Matt Smith's era had a good year left in the tank to play with a lot of these elements and to bring them back as Matt Smith's Doctor, the 11th Doctor, aged within his own life. Because I think you're right about these villains, and I think that viewers would have appreciated seeing it all wrapped up a little less quickly, and seeing some of these characters again.
Yeah, no, I can agree with you on that. Norm, what about you? Because I know I've had this discussion with a few other people, and I mean, I think the Weeping Angels especially stand out from Matt Smith's run. Again, taking a concept that was kind of there from Tennant's run, especially like River Song, and just adding it and just growing it so immensely. But I mean, to me, it's when I think Matt Smith's run, the villains I think about are the Weeping Angels and the Silents.
Well, obviously, the Weeping Angels is indelible to Matt Smith because of how they use them so effectively, in a sense, with the Angels Take Manhattan, and then the way that they wrote out Amy and Rory. However, I always feel that at a point in time, unless you do it with a little bit more of a careful hand, I always felt that the Weeping Angels were a little heavy-handed in what they could do. I always felt that an enemy like that, or a villain like that, they're sometimes used as a forced aspect of the narrative to do something dramatic. Meaning that I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of a clever way for Amy and Rory to have departed the show, aside from the fact that you're going to have this giant weeping angel version of the Statue of Liberty chasing them, or just things like that. I just felt that was a little too contrived for my taste, because when you saw them in Blink, they were terrifying, but the more they get referenced in Doctor Who, the less terrifying they become. Much like the Daleks. The Daleks, they were terrifying at first, and now they're kind of kitsch, which is why I'm glad that Chibnall's not going to do that. He's not going to the familiar territory there. I mean, when I saw the Zygons in the 50th anniversary, I'm like, yes, Zygons, awesome. But they weren't overused. The same thing with the Ice Warriors, in one of the Capaldi season 10 episodes. I think that was awesome because you don't see Ice Warriors. So when you take something as powerful and as unique as the Weeping Angels and just kind of like, I don't know, arbitrarily put them in there, I think they become less effective over time. So I understand why they did it. And I know that the Weeping Angels are kind of the quote unquote villain without the Master. And it would have been interesting to see like where the Master fit in Smith's run. But I'm kind of glad that they're going to be steering away from a lot of the traditional villains now. I want to see new villains grow and be introduced. I really think that that's what they did with Blink, but I don't think that they handled the Weeping Angels that well moving forward. That's just me, though. I don't know. I thought they were so cool, and then they became coffee urns and coffie mugs and products to be sold. They
were over marketed for you.
Yeah, I want to see things that are just a little less George Lucas strategy marketplace action figure. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the knocks of maybe on the run of the 11th Doctor. There was a little bit of that, especially because of the popularity in the States and with what BBC America was trying to do in marketing the Doctor, which leads me into kind of our fourth point of the show here. One thing I thought the 11th Doctor's run had in it, and Doctor Who's always been famous for guest stars, but in this case, getting a lot of guest stars who were already known or became very known shortly thereafter was a big thing, I think, for the run of the 11th Doctor. Just going off down through some of the names here. We had John Hurt, obviously, the great John Hurt as the War Doctor. David Bradley, before he became a doctor himself, as Solomon. James Corden, who we've already mentioned in this show, in a couple episodes, and some of my favorite episodes of the Matt Smith run, as Craig Owens. Bill Nighy, the caretaker in Vincent and the Doctor, still probably one of my all-time favorite Matt Smith episodes ever. The Christmas Carol episode, Michael Gambon, who of course played Dumbledore in the Harry Potter films, as well as Katherine Jenkins, it was amazing. I have friends who got hooked on Who just from her performance in that Christmas Carol special. Mark Sheppard, very known here in the States, especially for his run on Supernatural as Canton in the beginning of season 6. Tony Curran, which I know is a name familiar to you, Norman, with your love of Defiance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was Daytak Tar in Defiance.
Yeah, as the amazing Vincent Van Gogh.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the amazing Sir Ian McKellen as the voice of the Great Intelligence in that Christmas episode. And of course, Ian Glenn, famous of Game of Thrones, playing Sir Father Octavius in the first appearance of the Weeping Angels for Matt Smith. And those are just some of the names that have made appearances during Matt Smith's run as Doctor Who. And again, for the most part, names that American audiences were already familiar with in one way or the other, even before they had been on Doctor Who.
I mean, I remember seeing Tony Curran. He was in Underworld, I do believe. Yes. As was Bill Nighy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They were. Yeah, they were. Yeah. So there's a little bit there. Obviously, Ian Glenn. He was Sir Father Octavius and also Sir Jorah Mormont. But I think maybe the most famous, iconic element from Matt Smith's run isn't not necessarily Tony Curran as Vincent Van Gogh. Or is it Go? Mm-hmm. They say Gogh in the show. How do the UKers do it?
Yeah, Dan.
I've never been able to get an answer on this either. I always say Van Gogh.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, that's what I thought too.
Okay, so listeners, weigh in on that. Maybe we'll put up a poll. Either way, the exploding TARDIS is probably one of the most iconic pieces of Doctor Who artwork probably ever. It is on everything. I have a rug that was sold by Think Geek. It's on my floor. I'll take a picture of it maybe and post it later on Type 40.
I've never seen
but there's a rug there. I have a picture of it on my wall. It's just because it's done in the style of Vincent Van Gogh. it just became really iconic and in a way almost kind of like a statement, for that era. So yeah, John Hurt. I mean, we can go all the way back to Alien with John Hurt, right?
Yeah,
Or in the Elephant Man. I mean, he's legendary. Right?
Yeah, and we're gonna get more into John Hurt in just a few minutes. But what about you, Dan? I mean, this is a pretty powerful list of names making guest appearances in the 11th run.
Yeah. And what tracks back to me, just hearing Norm there talk about his rug. I've never seen the rug because I've got the poster myself as well. I don't even like it that much, and I've got the poster. But when talking about that, and you're absolutely right, it was an unforgettable image. It's what you might call now a mashup, isn't it, of Doctor Who meets Van Gogh. And you can get that on pretty much any item of merchandise that you could care to name. But when I was talking earlier on about the Stephen Moffat era being stocked full of ideas, some formed better than others, deliberately so, left in the mind, and some of them just really powerful imagery. Looking at this cast list again, going back over some of the people that they put in place in these key roles. Well, most of them were key roles. There was plenty of smaller roles as well. When I look at Stephen Burkoff's part, Stephen Burkoff was in Doctor Who. I still can't quite believe that. Stephen Burkoff in The Power of Three, let alone, as you've quite rightly said, Ian Glenn and Bill Nighy. All these, some of them were, Bill Nighy had worked with Richard Curtis, who wrote Vincent of the Doctor. Bill Nighy had worked with Richard Curtis 2 or 3 times. So there were sort of shortcuts there, but I would imagine that Bill Nighy, he didn't need a great deal of arm twisting, and most of the actors that you've named, were more than happy to be in Doctor Who. In fact, I understand that Ian McKellen would have loved to have appeared on screen. It was only by virtue of the fact that the guy, even into his, I think, early 80s now, is still so prolific, still so much in demand, that he couldn't make a further or bigger appearance. But when I look at James Corden, again, going back to what I was saying about seeing some of these characters again, to me, the James Corden character, I mean, particularly the first episode, it had got this quality about it whereby not just James Corden's Craig, but various other characters deserved that final return visit. And I think another episode with Craig would have made such a great trilogy. Later in the 11th Doctor's life. Some of the actors are bigger names in your part of the world than ours. That can't be argued. Mark Sheppard in particular, and Tony Curran. Neither of those you could. Most of the UK couldn't pick those two guys out in a bus queue. But yeah, David Bradley, he seems to get more beloved as time goes on. Again, no spring chicken, but role after role after role just seems to get bigger, and he's obviously loving any of his associations with Doctor Who, and fandom just adores the man. So these are casting choices that were made not cynically. I won't have that. Even the Bill Nighy choice, they were timely, and they're memorable, and they are probably, I can see why American audiences, why it would get your attention even more. I don't think that's why it was done. I think it tracks right the way back to the original casting of Catherine Tate, and then Kylie Minogue and David Morrissey. It follows right back through there, whereby at one point it was just for the Christmas specials, became an almost every episode occurrence. But it's so played a part in raising Doctor Who's profile, so played a part in feeling like it belongs in the very, very top tier of international genre series. I'm talking about the top tier. I'm thinking of Game of Thrones, The Walking Dead, and Doctor Who. That maybe I'm maybe I'm being naive there. What would you say? Is that a fair approximation?
I think it's a very fair approximation, and I think, and at least I think very well in the final point I have for this episode, guys, and that is the Doctor Who 50th anniversary took place during the 11th Doctor's run, which of course led to our 50th anniversary special, which brought together David Tennant and Matt Smith, by far the most, I would say, the two most well-known doctors in the United States, as well as bringing in John Hurt's War Doctor and making this major event that actually even aired in movie theaters in the US before it actually was broadcast on television here by about 48 hours. And I don't know if you recall this or not, because I actually attended one. Fathom Events ran the Day of the Doctor in movie theaters 2 days before the actual broadcast premiere of the Doctor Who 50th anniversary special, Norman.
And not to continue to profess my love, but there also was a certain curator in the 50th.
I was going to get to that.
Tom Baker made his, I guess, first public appearance as the quote-unquote doctor at the end of that, showing, you're compressing time with, Tom Baker's era and then Matt Smith's era, which was fantastic because I don't know about you both, but as soon as I heard him say, "Well, you might," I was like, what is happening right now? Like every single goose pimple on my body just went up like just through the roof. I knew it for, here's a funny thing. There's a YouTube, I guess a reaction star out there who was watching it. And when she was doing her review, she said, "Oh, look, another one of the old doctors." And my jaw dropped. I'm like, it's like, that's Tom Baker. How do you say like one of the old doctors? But she is. I guess she's a fan of the newer series, which is fine. I mean, I'm glad that she is, and she has a huge following on YouTube. But for me, when I love that episode because they were showing a lot of respect to a lot of the iconic figures that came before, and even though he only had a handful of minutes total in the history of Doctor Who, John Hurt is the War Doctor with the weapon to end all wars. What was that called? Like the movement, I think it was.
Yeah, I think so. I'm
that
drawing a blank on that now.
The moment.
The moment. That's
moment.
it. The moment. That clock box that took on the personification of Billy Piper for some reason. That was just. It was awesome. That's a whole episode on and of itself, talking about the 50th. But yeah, what you were saying, Dan, when you have actors of a certain caliber appear on a show, even in a cameo performance, it does raise the profile in the overall audience's opinion of, okay, we have just crossed a threshold from this type of show to this type of show. Very much like the way that, say, Marvel, their Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, they were all great. But as soon as you started getting Academy Award-winning actors that want to be in these movies, it changes the scope and the opinion of what these movies are towards the casual fan, towards a global audience. Because now you're having legitimate, I'm not saying the other actors weren't high quality, but you're having like these award-winning actors that are bringing everyone else's game way up. So, and the profile of what the quality is of that show to an audience. So I think it's great that that Doctor Who still gets these quality caliber actors. And it's going to be interesting to see what they get with Jodi Whittaker's series as well, because now Doctor Who is, I mean, the fingerprint on Doctor Who is everywhere. So yeah, I don't see why you wouldn't want to be a part of it if they asked you to do it.
Yeah. Now, Dan, I want to ask you real quick, because I mean, obviously the 50th in Doctor Who was absolutely a huge deal. I mean, it was big here in the States, but it was even, I know it was even more, it was just huge for you guys over in the UK. What was the reaction like to see not only David Tennant and Matt Smith on the screen, but we actually see at one point, yes, all 13 doctors, because at the time we even get a quick shot of Peter Capaldi, even if it's just the eye shot. I mean, how special was that 50th anniversary? And to have really kind of, and we talk about, we have Matt Smith, who's kind of the American doctor, but we have David Tennant and Tom Baker in it. representing our generational doctors.
Well, Norm, as Norm was saying, I mean, that piece of television is pretty much as cinematic as television can get. I saw it at the cinema as well, and yeah, I mean, there's easily an episode's worth of conversation in that for another day. But as regards just the fact that Stephen Moffat and Matt Smith pulled that off, when it could have quite easily have been the biggest disappointment of the year, and it somehow managed to please everybody. And it's the audacity of it. Even now, I was there, and I still can't quite believe it worked. And given as well, we now know that the odds were stacked. The odds were stacked against this special. There really were. They had nobody under contract apart from Jenna Coleman. The shape of the special was changing constantly. Of course, Stephen Moffat was quite famously turned down by Chris Eccleston, who was in the original script as number 9. So it would seem that the stars just came into alignment with it and created a magic. It's next to impossible to be unemotional about that special, and why should we be? If a 50th anniversary isn't a time to be unashamed and to be indulged and indulgent, because the people on screen, they've got every right to enjoy themselves as much as we did. If that's not the occasion to do that, then I don't know when is. As regards the show's profile, I did wonder about this from this perspective that we're talking about, because it had only been, here's the 50th anniversary show, but this is also a show which had only really been around for 3, 4, 5 years in the eyes and hearts of a lot of the international audience. So I was wondering, do you think anybody was confused by this? Did people just roll with it internationally? Because, say, over here, we'd had the big gap in between, but there was something just very right about it. It never really disappeared from the public conscience. But how did it play out was there any resistance, any sort of bewilderment at this new-ish show being given this gala treatment and having this sort of song and dance made about just this one episode?
Yeah, I would say no. I think a lot of people by that point had understood the history of Doctor Who and had been brought up to speed on it. And like Norman said, I think the 50th is its own episode onto itself, which we will get to here on Type 40. But no, I think, Dan, that it was very much accepted, and people really understood the history of Who by that point, even though that there were still a younger generation who maybe never saw Tom Baker on the screen, so they reacted like they did when they saw him on YouTube.
And it's one thing to know. It's one thing to know and to understand. I mean, as Norm was talking about the lady on YouTube there with the reaction video, which I know would drive some people insane. But it's one thing to recognise a history, but it's sort of you don't need the knowledge. You just need to be aware. Well, you don't even need to, but you can benefit from an awareness of the shape of it, and develop that sort of instinct to recognise the language of it. That this is a show that's unlike any other. It's not Doctor Who's not unbeatable. It's not bomb-proof, and I do I can't. No, I'm not getting all serious about it, but I can't get this over to people often enough. It isn't bomb-proof, and it does need care and attention, and it does need a good shake-up every few years. But these elements, they are almost, there's not many of them, but those that are there, in the way that the stories roll out, it is timeless, and it is still unique. We've had other programmes, I won't say copy, but emulate Doctor Who to one degree or another, both in the UK. I'm looking at you, Primeval. And in America, with the recent time travel show that has just been cancelled again, Timeless. And of course the Legends of Tomorrow, which I absolutely love. But they're very blatant about it. But I think all roads point back to Doctor Who from all of these shows. And I mean, when I talk to, getting to know you two and various other people who talk about Doctor Who with such fondness, and it seems quite obvious to me that the growth of it internationally has been not just for Doctor Who's benefit, but for the audience's benefit as well. And I know that UK fans, maybe we can be a little proprietorial about it, and there's the whole question of it still being made by the BBC. It's still funded by the license fee, which can get people's danders up. That's another British expression, dander. Look up dander. It can rile people. But the basic underlying principle of it is that Doctor Who continues to evolve as we follow it, as it rolls out, and as long as it happens in this kind of way. Yeah, and it's brilliant to look back as well as look forward. But as long as it happens in this organic way, then there is really no reason why, with sensitive handling, we won't just see this 60th anniversary that we're now talking of. We mentioned it earlier on, or already we're talking about it, but that we won't see the 70th as well. And I think this is a direct result. Doctor Who's always been a good show. I'm sure if it would have stayed a solely British production, it would have still been a good show. But would it have endured and grown the way it has without this whole journey that we've spoken of in this episode? Probably not. Probably not.
And with that, I think that's some great points by Dan. We're going to take a moment to deal with another fixed point in time as we introduce you to many of the other great shows here on the Fandom Podcast Network. Hey, Kevin, I hear you're one of the Fandom Podcast Network's co-founders.
I heard the same rumor about you too, Kyle. Like the Three Musketeers, we would be incomplete without our third member and co-founder, Norman.
Thank you, gentlemen. It's an honor to be part of the Fandom Podcast Network with you two. Kyle, why don't you start us off and let everyone know what great shows we have on the network?
Absolutely. Starting with our flagship show on the network, we have Culture Clash, your weekly fandom news show covering everything news, reviews, and whatever crazy things we can come up with. Of course, we also have Good Evening, an Alfred Hitchcock podcast with Tom Caldwell, Brandon Shea-Matula, and Chris High. Kevin, what else do we have on the network?
Kyle, we also have Time Warp, a look back on our classic and nostalgic fandoms that we still celebrate today. Also, if you're a hard rock music fan, I host the Hair Metal podcast as we rediscover the nostalgia of the 1980s hair metal bands. Norman, we're not done yet. What else have we got on the Fandom Podcast Network?
Well, Kevin, you and I co-host Blood of Kings, a Highlander podcast covering all things Highlander. And I also co-host with you, Kevin, and Kyle, and other special guests, Discoville, a Star Trek Discovery, and the Orville podcast. But Kyle, last and certainly not least, what are the other shows on the network?
Well, for all you movie fans out there, this podcast is for you. We have Couch Potato Theater covering cult classic and fan favorite movies we don't get off the couch for. And for you football fans, we have this show for you, The End Zone, giving you all the great mediocre fantasy football advice you can get and covering everything the NFL. And finally, you Doctor Who fans out there, we have Type 40, a Doctor Who fandom podcast. Now, Kevin, can you tell everyone how to find all these great programs on the Fandom Podcast Network?
Sure, Kyle. You can find the Fandom Podcast Network master feed at thefpnet.podbean.com. The Fandom Podcast Network is on iTunes, Stitcher, Podbean, and Google Play. You can also find us on Facebook under Fandom Podcast Network. If you'd like to email us, you can email us at fandompodcastnetwork@gmail.com. We are also on Instagram under Fandom Podcast Network and on Twitter at FanPodNetwork.
Also, please search Fandom Podcast Network on tpublic.com for our store, where you can find all our shows and their logos and great t-shirts and other fun items. Also, please search Fandom Podcast Network on iTunes and leave us a review.
Thank you so much for listening and supporting the Fandom Podcast Network. And remember, respect others and most importantly, enjoy your fandom. And we're back, and this has been a great conversation, gentlemen. Dan, you had some very eloquent words there, but Norman, I want to give you a chance to throw out some final thoughts on the 11th Doctor's run.
When you proposed this show, it was hard for me to kind of grasp the aspect of the Americanization of Matt Smith being the quote unquote the American fans' Doctor. Because I've always felt that kind of fandom is a global thing, that it doesn't really have kind of like geographical boundaries. But I think in a sense, you're right that if any Doctor has been able to capture the American audience, it probably has been Matt Smith. And I think it goes back to another conversation that I had with some friends talking about Doctor Who, where one of my friends said that she used to watch it with her nieces, who are now in their late teens, and they were the fans that have grown with the brand, much like the Harry Potter fans have grown with their brand. I mean, Harry Potter spanned a course of, let's say, conservatively a good 15 to 20 years with fans, from the books to the movies.
Yeah, that's about right.
So think about fans in their 5, 6, 7 years old, maybe 10, and they grew throughout the franchise as the characters also developed. They became in their late teens, early 20s. This is the fan base now for Doctor Who. Young men and young women, I'm going to say in a general sense, that are continuing to bring this franchise forward. And as they become parents themselves, they're going to be exposing their children to this particular era of Doctor Who. So I think that you're right, Dan. There's going to be a perpetual effect of Doctor Who moving forward into the 60th and 70th anniversaries. I mean, for some of us, we'll be blessed to be able to see those. But what I also loved about especially the 50th is that even one small reference to Tom Baker's character will allow fans of today to go back and say, why was this character important? And they'll be able to experience the entire wealth of the past of Doctor Who, which I think is also very important. It's kind of like you find a band now, and then someone says, hey, you should really have listened to them 20 years ago. They're two different flavors, but they're the exact same emotional experience that means something special to you. So Matt Smith was able to do that. And I think that because of maybe it was him, or maybe it was the circumstance, or maybe it was a combination of both, that he was able to catapult Doctor Who into superstardom, whereas, say, Christopher Eccleston and David Tennant were able to ground Doctor Who for an audience to take the show more seriously as a product from the BBC than in years past, where people would look at Doctor Who and say, like, oh, yeah, that's the one with the rubber monsters and the guy with the scarf and the teeth and the hat, right? That was an unfair way in a certain sense of categorizing that product. But now Doctor Who is hip, sexy, popular, high quality, and one of the, if not the tentpole fandom that's out there, even more so than Star Trek, in my opinion. So those are my final thoughts.
Yeah, no, I very good things. And in closing out, I just want to say too, I mean, I think without a shadow of a doubt, we can all agree David Tennant was the one who got the ball rolling for Doctor Who in the U.S. I think that's a given. But I think it really was Matt Smith with Stephen Moffat, Karen Gillan, Arthur Darvill, Alex Kingston, and Jenna Coleman who really caused the explosion of the Doctor in the U.S. to the success it is now. And you look at how their careers have gone since then. Obviously, Matt Smith maybe isn't quite out there as much in the States as he was, but he's had great roles in the Netflix show The Crown. He's also been in Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies. You've got his appearance in Terminator Genesis. He also has a movie coming out called Patient Zero, and he's actually going to be playing Charles Manson in a biopic film. You look at Arthur Darvill, who graduated himself to becoming a Time Lord. in DC's Legends of Tomorrow. Plus, he has also had a good run on Broadchurch himself. And of course, Alex Kingston continues to march on with her very successful career. But I think it's safe to say, if you're going to talk about having pure success coming out of Doctor Who, Karen Gillan, between Jumanji, the success she's had as Nebula in the Marvel Universe, and what that's brought to her, other things she's done, such as Oculus, and many other appearances on shows, TVs, movies. Karen Gillan was the breakout star of the season run in the Americas. And I just got one final quick note. I remember a couple of years at Comic-Con when they were promoting the original Guardians of the Galaxy at Comic-Con, and she took off the wig, and the cries of fandom were heard worldwide. But with that, I want to thank my co-hosts, Dan and Norman, and everybody listening here on the Fandom Podcast Network, as I am getting ready to lock myself in the Pandoricum, revisit a few old faces, and get ready for the next episode of Type 40, a Doctor Who podcast. And with that, everyone, Geronimo!